In 1916, the Western Front had already been locked in stalemate for over a year. Millions had died. Hundreds of miles of trenches scarred Europe from the North Sea to Switzerland. The war that leaders once believed would be short and decisive had become a grinding industrial struggle. Then, in February 1916, Germany launched an offensive against a French fortress city that would become synonymous with endurance and destruction. The battle would last 10 months. It would cause over 700,000 casualties, and it would raise one of the most debated questions in military history. Was Verdun designed to capture territory, or to bleed France white? This is the logic behind the longest battle of the First World War, the Battle of Verdun. The strategic context, why 1916 needed something different. By early 1916, the Western Front had solidified into trench systems stretching across France and Belgium. Attempted breakthrough in 1915 had failed on both sides. The massive Allied offensives at Second Battle of Ypres and Second Battle of Artois had yielded little territorial gain at enormous cost. Germany faced a strategic dilemma. Britain's naval blockade was tightening. The war in the east against Russia was ongoing. Austria-Hungary was under strain. Germany could not afford a war of indefinite attrition. The German chief of the General Staff, Erich von Falkenhayn, believed Germany could not win through a massive breakthrough like 1914. Instead, he concluded the war must be won by exhausting one of the Entente powers. But which one? Russia still had manpower reserves. Britain had industrial strength and a growing army. Falkenhayn identified what he believed was the weakest pillar of the alliance, France. France had already suffered devastating losses in 1914 to 1915. Its population was smaller than Germany's. Its manpower reserves were finite. If France could be pushed to the brink of collapse, Britain might negotiate. Falkenhayn's logic was not about territory. It was about attrition as strategy. Why Verdun? Geography and psychology. If Germany intended to force France into a battle of exhaustion, the choice of target mattered enormously. Verdun was not selected randomly. The city of Verdun sat along the Meuse River in northeastern France. It was surrounded by a ring of powerful fortifications built after the Franco-Prussian War. These included massive concrete forts such as Fort Douaumont, Fort Vaux. Strategically, Verdun formed a salient, a bulge, in the French lines. It was vulnerable from three sides. Operationally, this gave Germany advantages. Concentrated artillery fire could be directed onto a confined front. German supply lines were shorter. French reinforcement routes were limited. But Verdun was more than geography. It was symbolic. Verdun had historical significance dating back centuries. It had resisted invasions before. It represented French national resilience. Abandoning it would be politically and psychologically devastating. Falkenhayn allegedly wrote in a December 1915 memorandum that France would throw every available man into defending Verdun. The goal was not necessarily to capture the city, but to force France to commit its army into a meat grinder under German artillery superiority. Historians still debate whether this bleed France white memorandum existed in the exact form later published. But whether or not the wording is authentic, the operational design suggests attrition was central to the plan. Verdun was chosen because France could not afford to lose it. France could not afford to defend it. And Germany believed it could dominate the battlefield with artillery. The German plan controlled attrition. Falkenhayn did not envision a sweeping breakthrough like 1914. Instead, the plan relied on several key assumptions. Number one, artillery superiority. Germany assembled over 1,200 guns, including heavy and super heavy artillery. Among them were massive siege howitzers capable of destroying concrete fortifications. The opening bombardment, beginning on February 21st, 1916, would be one of the heaviest in history up to that point. The idea was simple. Pulverize French forward positions. Force French reinforcements into exposed routes. Destroy them with concentrated fire. Artillery was no longer merely preparation for infantry assault. It was the main weapon. Number two, limited infantry objectives. German infantry were not initially tasked with deep penetration. Instead, they were to capture tactically valuable high ground, establish defensible positions, allow artillery to continue inflicting casualties. This was not a gamble for rapid victory. It was an industrialized killing zone. Number 3 key assumptions is geographic compression. Verdun's terrain helped the Germans. The Meuse River divided the battlefield into east and west banks. High ground, such as the heights of the Meuse, offered observation points for artillery. If Germany controlled these heights, French positions would become untenable. The battle would become not one of sweeping maneuvers, but controlling ridges, forts, and artillery observation posts. February 21st, 1916, the storm begins. At 7:15 a.m. on February 21st, 1916, the German artillery opened fire. For nearly 9 hours, shells rained down on French lines. Entire forests were shredded. Trenches collapsed. Communication lines were severed. Units were isolated. Then German infantry advanced under what was an innovative storm tactics, using small assault units trained to move quickly and exploit weak points. The initial German gains were significant. On February 25th, German forces captured Fort Douaumont, the largest and most powerful of Verdun's forts, with surprisingly little resistance. This was a major psychological shock. A fort believed to be nearly impregnable had fallen. But here, something critical happened. Instead of collapsing, France reorganized. The French response, ILS any passer en pas. France appointed Philippe Pétain to command the defense of Verdun. Pétain understood something crucial. The battle could not be won by holding every inch of ground at any cost. Instead, it would be won by managing attrition intelligently. He implemented several key reforms. Number 1, rotational defense. Rather than allowing units to be destroyed in place, Pétain rotated divisions regularly through Verdun. Nearly 70% of the French army would eventually serve there. This ensured shared sacrifice across the army. No single unit was annihilated completely. Morale was maintained nationally. Number 2 key reforms. The Voie Sacrée, the Sacred Way. A critical supply road from Bar-le-Duc to Verdun became the lifeline of the defense. Constant truck convoys moved. Troops, ammunition, food, medical supplies. At its peak, a truck passed every few seconds. Verdun was not just a battle of trenches. It was a battle of logistics. Number 3 key reforms. Artillery counterfire. French artillery gradually reorganized and responded effectively. The German expectation that artillery dominance would remain one-sided began to falter. The battle evolved into mutual destruction. Did Falkenhayn miscalculate? Here lies the central question. Was Verdun truly meant to bleed France white, or was that justification written after the fact? Some historians argue Falkenhayn intended a limited offensive. It escalated beyond control. Germany became trapped in the very attritional battle it had designed for France. Others argue the plan always centered on attrition. It worked, but at a cost Germany could not sustain. What is clear is this. By spring 1916, Germany was suffering enormous casualties as well. Verdun was no longer a one-sided killing ground. It had become a mutual furnace. The industrial reality of Verdun. By mid-1916, Verdun symbolized something larger than strategy. It represented industrialized warfare at full scale. Massive artillery concentrations, continuous shell fire, mechanical supply systems, national mobilization. The landscape itself was permanently transformed. Villages vanished. Forests became splintered wastelands. The earth was so churned by shells that even today parts of Verdun remain scarred. This was no longer Napoleonic maneuver warfare. This was modern total war. Closing for Part 1, 32:00, end. By early summer 1916, Verdun had already consumed hundreds of thousands of men. Germany had failed to break France. France had failed to dislodge Germany. And yet neither side disengaged. What began as a calculated attempt to control attrition had become something else, a test of national endurance. Escalation, the Somme, and strategic consequences. By early summer 1916, the Battle of Verdun had already shattered expectations. Germany had launched the offensive intending to force France into a controlled battle of attrition. Instead, the battlefield had become a furnace consuming both armies. Fort Douaumont had fallen. The French had reorganized under Pétain. The Sacred Way kept Verdun alive, but Verdun was about to expand. What began as a calculated offensive on the east bank of the Meuse would widen into a struggle for high ground, artillery dominance, and eventually strategic survival. And beyond Verdun itself, a second storm was gathering. The coming Allied offensive on the Somme, the West Bank crisis, artillery, and high ground. In the early phases of the battle, German operations concentrated primarily on the east bank of the Meuse River. However, a critical oversight soon became apparent. French artillery positioned on the West Bank heights, particularly around Le Mortem, Côte 304, was firing directly into German assault formations advancing on the east bank. The geography of Verdun made control of elevation decisive. Observation meant accurate artillery fire. Accurate artillery fire meant survival. Germany now faced a choice: ignore the West Bank and accept devastating crossfire, or expand the battle. They chose expansion. Beginning in March 1916, German forces attacked the West Bank heights. What followed was some of the most intense artillery combat of the entire war. Mortem and Côte 304 changed hands multiple times. The terrain was reduced to shattered mud and craters. Casualties mounted rapidly. Here, the logic of controlled attrition began to unravel. Instead of forcing France into a confined defensive struggle, Germany had widened the battlefield. More troops, more guns, more ammunition. Verdun was no longer a focus operation. It was becoming an all-consuming commitment. Fort Vaux and the limits of endurance. After the early capture of Fort Douaumont, German forces pressed toward another major objective: Fort Vaux. Unlike Douaumont, Fort Vaux was fiercely defended. In June 1916, under the command of Major Sylvain Raynal, French troops held out under brutal conditions: continuous shelling, poison gas attacks, water shortages, close quarters fighting inside corridors. The defense of Fort Vaux became a symbol of French endurance. Eventually, the garrison surrendered due to lack of water, not because of tactical collapse. The fort fell, but the cost was high. German gains were measured in meters. Casualties continued to rise on both sides. The battle was no longer a swift execution of strategic logic. It was mutual exhaustion. The Somme changes everything. While Verdun raged, the Allies were planning their own major offensive. On July 1st, 1916, the British and French launched the Battle of the Somme. Originally conceived as a joint Franco-British offensive, the Somme's burden fell heavily on Britain because so many French forces were tied down at Verdun. The Somme had immediate consequences. Germany now faced a massive Allied offensive elsewhere on the Western Front. Resources had to be redistributed. Verdun could no longer receive unlimited priority. This is one of the most significant strategic turning points of 1916. Falkenhayn had intended Verdun to drain France. Instead, Verdun had fixed German forces in place. When the Somme began, Germany was forced into defensive operations on another major front. Attrition was now fully mutual, and industrial capacity began to matter more than tactical positioning. Command changes. Falkenhayn falls. By August 1916, it was clear that Verdun had not achieved decisive results. German casualties were enormous. France had not collapsed. Britain remained committed. Criticism mounted within German leadership. In late August 1916, Falkenhayn was replaced as chief of the General Staff by Paul von Hindenburg, Erich Ludendorff. The new leadership shifted German strategy toward total mobilization, what became known as the Hindenburg Program. Verdun was no longer viewed as a decisive battlefield of the war. Instead, Germany began preparing defensive depth systems that would later culminate in the Hindenburg Line. The logic had changed. Verdun had not broken France. It had revealed the scale of industrial warfare. French counteroffensives, reclaiming the ground. By autumn 1916, the balance began shifting. French artillery had grown more effective. Logistics through the Sacred Way continued functioning. German offensive momentum had slowed. In October and November 1916, French forces launched counteroffensives that recaptured Fort Douaumont, Fort Vaux. These operations were carefully planned, heavily supported by artillery and methodical. This marked a crucial point. Germany's original territorial gains were largely reversed. After 10 months of fighting, the front lines were close to where they had been in February. The human cost, however, was staggering. Casualties in the arithmetic of attrition. Verdun resulted in approximately 300,000 dead, over 400,000 wounded, roughly equal losses on both sides. Exact figures vary by historian, but the consensus is clear. The attritional balance did not decisively favor Germany. If Falkenhayn's objective was to inflict disproportionate losses on France, the outcome is debatable. Germany suffered comparable casualties at a time when it faced multiple fronts and tightening blockade conditions. Verdun demonstrated a harsh truth. In industrial warfare, deliberate attrition is difficult to control. Once begun, it consumes both attacker and defender, psychological and national impact. If Verdun did not deliver strategic victory, it achieved something else, particularly for France. Verdun became a national symbol. The phrase, "Ils ne passeront pas," they shall not pass, became associated with the defense. Nearly 3/4 of the French army rotated through Verdun during 1916. This created shared national sacrifice, shared memory, a unifying myth of endurance. For Germany, Verdun became a warning. The belief that artillery dominance could engineer a calculated attritional collapse proved overly optimistic. The battle exposed the limits of offensive warfare on the Western Front, a lesson that shaped German defensive planning for the remainder of the war. Was Verdun meant to bleed France white? Now we return to the central question. Did Falkenhayn design Verdun specifically to bleed France white? Historians debate this for several reasons. The famous Christmas memorandum describing the strategy surfaced after the war. Some argue Falkenhayn reframed his intentions to justify failure. Others argue the operational design clearly reflects an attritional goal. What we can state with scholarly caution: Verdun was not a classic breakthrough attempt. It relied heavily on artillery superiority. It aimed to force France into sustained defense. It anticipated high French casualties. However, the assumption that Germany could regulate attrition without suffering equally proved unrealistic. Verdun did not collapse France. Instead, it hardened French resolve. Verdun's legacy in military thought. Verdun became a case study in industrial-scale attrition, logistics under sustained fire, the power of national symbolism, the limits of offensive operations in trench warfare. Military academies have since studied Verdun not as a tale of incompetence, but as a lesson in strategic miscalculation under modern industrial conditions. It showed that in 20th century warfare, firepower dominates maneuver, logistics determine endurance, morale can outweigh territorial loss. Attrition cannot be neatly controlled. By December 1916, the battle ended not with decisive breakthrough, but exhaustion. The lines were largely unchanged, but Europe was irrevocably altered. Verdun became more than a battlefield. It became a warning. Verdun did not decide the First World War, but it defined it. It showed what total industrial conflict looked like when neither side could afford a retreat, and neither could achieve decisive victory. And in doing so, it forced every major power to confront a new reality. Modern war was not about rapid conquest. It was about endurance and survival. If you found this analysis valuable, consider subscribing to Recorded Conflicts for more structured, evidence-based war history.